As the street got darker, I, Pablo, a young student, put my tools away and went to the trailer to change. I had been working on the construction site for 3 months to help my sick grandmother. She needed very expensive medication. I didn't have a father, and my mother also had to work double shifts. Together, we managed to cover the costs of my grandmother's treatment, but we could barely support ourselves. I was very tired because, in addition to work, I was in my 3rd year at university. As I took off my dirty uniform and enjoyed the hot water, I mentally anticipated a nice evening with my classmates. We were planning to watch soccer in one of the sports cafes in the city center. However, as soon as I got dressed, I received a message from my mother. "Grandma is very ill. I think it's the end. Come as soon as you can," she wrote, ending with a sad emoji. Worried, I called a cab and gave the driver the address of the hospital. I didn't like going there. The strong smells, the sad and frightened faces, the doctors and staff always rushing around, the cold lighting. Until the last moment, I hoped that my grandmother, my dear grandmother, would soon be released from that gloomy place. However, my mother's message dispelled my illusions. I sighed and called the elevator to go up to the 4th floor. Maybe I could find my grandmother's room in total darkness. I had visited her so many times, and now it seemed like I was doing it for the last time. My heart squeezed. A treacherous knot rose in my throat, and I desperately wanted to cry. I gritted my teeth because I knew that tears wouldn't help my grandmother. I had to be strong and be able to tell the person I loved the most how much I loved her and how much I would miss her. I entered the room without knocking, trying not to make any unnecessary noise. All the nurses and doctors were used to me and paid no attention. However, there was no one else in the room apart from my mother and grandmother. At the sight of the latter, a pain pierced my heart again. During her illness, my grandmother had become extremely thin, almost weightless. I didn't know how she was still holding on. My grandmother's eyelids were closed. She was fast asleep. Her face was serene, with no signs of pain or suffering. And yet there was so much fragility in her whole appearance that I feared that, at some point, she would simply dissolve into thin air. Again, with an effort of will, I choked back my tears and approached the bed. "How is she?" I whispered to my mother, who was holding my grandmother's hand, pale and sad. "She's very weak," my mother whispered back. Her hair was disheveled, her shoulders slumped as if she carried the weight of the world on them. I hugged my mother. "You need to rest, Mom," I whispered softly, but she just shook her head. "I can't leave now. The doctor said that Grandma probably won't make it through the night." With those words, my mother began to cry silently. There was nothing I could do but hug her tightly. When she had calmed down a bit, I suggested we walk to the cafeteria. "Are you sure? I'm afraid to leave you even for a minute." I looked confidently into my mother's eyes. "Don't worry, I'll stay here. Go and have something hot and a snack." My mother shook her head. "I wouldn't be able to swallow anything right now." "You need to take care of yourself, Mom. I don't want you to end up in hospital too," I argued. My mother nodded gratefully. "You're right, son. I'll try to eat something." With those words, she left the room. I sighed and looked at my sleeping grandmother again. Random childhood memories began to flood my mind. Grandma taking me to the amusement park where I tasted mint ice cream in a crunchy shell for the first time. Her giving me a fluffy white bunny as a birthday present. What a happy day that was. I was so immersed in my memories that I didn't immediately notice my grandmother's soft sigh. I only realized when she let out a weak moan and opened her eyes. I gently took my grandmother's hand and smiled warmly at her. "Abuela, how are you?" But she didn't answer me. She looked at me as if she couldn't understand who was standing in front of her. "Is it you, Felipe?" she whispered. "Did you come to pick me up?" I was a little surprised. I didn't know who Felipe was. My grandfather's name was also Pablo. "Abuela, it's me, your grandson." For a few moments, she looked at me without understanding. "Oh, it's you, Pablito," she whispered. Did I sense a slight disappointment in her words, or was it just my imagination? I looked closely at my grandmother. Her gaze was distant, as if she was mentally very far away. "And who is Felipe?" I asked. My grandmother smiled faintly and closed her eyes, her face taking on a dreamy expression. "Felipe was my first love," she replied softly. I was extremely surprised. I had never imagined that my grandmother had loved anyone other than my grandfather. I even felt a little sorry for asking. It's a good thing my mother didn't hear, I thought, or maybe she knew. Women are more interested in these things. Perhaps my grandmother had already told my mother about her life before marriage. I was snapped out of my thoughts by a dry cough from my grandmother. The old woman coughed considerably and took a while to recover again. "That cough," Grandma complained. "I'm so tired of those bouts. It was different when I was young." I stroked my grandmother's hand. "Where did you live then, Abuela?" I asked. "Oh, I traveled around the country a lot. I worked in various places. I had a good education, you know. I was hired as a governess in the homes of wealthy families and raised the children of merchants and even aristocrats. How many girls I turned into ladies." Grandma said all this slowly and very quietly, but she kept smiling. How pleasant it is for old people to remember their youth. They always look back because they have nothing ahead of them, I thought sadly. The dreamy expression on Grandma's face suddenly turned worried. "Pablito, I know you will soon," Grandma began. But before she could finish her sentence, she was once again struck by a long coughing fit. All the while I held her hand. Finally, the coughing fit passed. "It's better not to waste your strength on words, Abuela," I advised, but Grandma stubbornly shook her head. "Don't interrupt me, Pablito." "I know better," she said. It was clear that the words were difficult for her, but the old woman had no intention of giving up. She had always been a warrior, it crossed my mind. From what I knew of my grandmother, she never gave up until the end and always persevered with her goals. "I know I'm going to die soon," Grandma continued. "The doctors have nothing to do with it. I can feel it." I wanted to argue, but Grandma motioned for me to shut up. "Listen, Pablito, before I die, there's something important I have to tell you. It's very important." Grandma's expression was very serious. At these words, I was surprised into silence. Suddenly, the doors to the room opened and a nurse came in. Grandma looked at her from under her eyebrows. "You're awake," she said amiably. "Do you need anything?" Grandma shook her head. Her whole posture said only one thing. She wanted the nurse to leave as soon as possible. Sensing this, she took the empty medicine bottles from the table and left the room. Grandma took a deep breath, summoning up the strength to continue, but the damn cough silenced her again for a long time. When the crisis passed, I noticed with pity that my grandmother had become even paler. "Pablito," she whispered. "Yes, Abuela," I replied, leaning a little closer. For some reason, I suddenly felt that after that, my life would never be the same. "In my red notebook, which is on the bedside table, you'll find the address of a lawyer," said Grandma. "When I die, go to him. He'll show you his house." I couldn't believe my ears. Had Grandma lost her mind? I thought. "Abuela, what are you talking about?" I asked aloud. "You'll know everything from the letter the lawyer will give you, Pablito," Grandma replied weakly. Her gaze, which had been roaming the walls for a long time, finally settled on me. "You've grown up so much, Pablito," said Grandma in admiration. Then she leaned back on the pillows and closed her eyes. "I'm so weak," she murmured almost inaudibly. "I want to get some sleep." I nodded without saying a word. I imagined my grandmother as a very young girl. What was she like back then? I knew that she had lost her parents at an early age and had to fend for herself. "You were always very strong, my fragile grandmother." My mother quietly entered the room. "Is she still asleep?" she whispered. "She woke up briefly," I replied softly. "She coughed a lot and said that I have a house." "What? What house?" My mother's eyes widened in surprise. "Maybe she imagined something," I shrugged. "Who knows what goes on in the minds of old people?" My mother agreed with me. That night, my grandmother passed away. She didn't wake up again and died peacefully in her sleep. As I was collecting my grandmother's belongings from the bedside table, I found a red notebook and absent-mindedly slipped it into my shirt pocket. The whole day passed in a flurry. My mother and I didn't have a single moment of peace. I was grateful for that, because it made me worry less about the loss. In the evening, when I returned to the dormitory and lay down on the bed without undressing, I felt something solid in my pocket and remembered the notebook. I took out the worn little book and started flipping through the pages. They were full of fragments of thoughts, poems, recipes, and shopping lists. With tears in my eyes, I looked at the handwriting familiar from my grandmother's childhood, running my finger over the well-kept letters. As I was about to close the notebook, I suddenly noticed an address and a signature on the last page. Lawyer Ismael Torres. I remembered my grandmother's last words. When I die, go to him. He'll show you his house. Could that be true? I couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about my grandmother's mysterious words. The next day, I woke up very early, despite having slept badly. First, I went to the construction site and announced that I was quitting. Then, I went to the train station and bought a ticket. I got some water and sandwiches, got into the train carriage and sat by the window. I had to travel all day. I looked out of the window and tried to guess what awaited me. I arrived in an unknown seaside town around dusk. I took a cab to one of the hotels in the center and stayed the night. The next day I had breakfast in a cafe and went to the address found in the red notebook. Finding the right house, I immediately saw a sign that said Legal Services. I approached the door and rang the silver bell. The door opened and I walked in, finding myself in a cozy hall opposite the reception desk. "How can I help you?" asked a charming girl, adjusting a lock of hair that had fallen out of place. "Sophia," read her name tag. I was a little surprised. I really liked the girl. So I recovered my thoughts and said, "I need to speak to the lawyer Ismael Torres. Can I do that now?" Sophia looked at the computer monitor and typed something on the keyboard. "He's currently with a client, but you can meet with Mr. Torres in about 15 minutes. Would you mind waiting a bit?" she replied, raising her blue eyes to me again. I melted completely, and nodding silently, sat down on the light leather sofa. Maybe I should ask for her number, I thought. Then I mentally shook my head. First, I needed to sort out my business. Then I could think about going on dates. Besides, this girl lives almost on the other side of the country. What was I thinking? Finally, the time came and Sophia accompanied me to the lawyer's office. I thanked the girl, and for a moment, I thought she blushed a little. Then I pushed those thoughts aside and knocked on the door. "Come in," came the invitation from behind the door. I opened the door and found myself in a spacious office. Behind a large, light wood desk sat a gray-haired man who looked at least 80, but the clear look in his eyes and the confidence with which he stood up to greet the client revealed strength and energy in him. Probably all thanks to the sea air. Everyone here looks very well, I thought to myself. I shook the lawyer's dry but firm hand and accepted the seat offered. "What should I call you?" asked Ismael Torres. I declared my first and last name. It matched my grandmother's. The lawyer didn't raise an eyebrow. I was anxious. If my grandmother had told the truth, he would surely remember her rare surname. But then I thought that maybe when my grandmother dealt with Torres, she was still using her maiden name. Gathering my courage, I began my story. I told the lawyer about my grandmother, her illness, and her last words to me before she passed away. Then I showed Ismael the entry in the red notebook and mentioned her name. Torres looked carefully at his own address for a moment, then remained silent for a while. "What do you think of that?" I asked nervously, anxious to know if my trip had been worthwhile. Torres sniffed slightly. "I remember your grandmother very well. She was a wonderful woman." "So she's gone?" It seemed to me that the lawyer discreetly wiped away a tear. "So my grandmother was telling the truth about some house that belongs to me?" I asked. The lawyer looked at me intently and nodded briefly. "Before we go any further, I'd like to carefully review your documents." "Of course," I nodded hastily. I took out a folder and handed it to Torres. The lawyer examined the documents in silence for a while. Then Ismael Torres got up and walked over to the large table where the files were kept. He stood there for a moment, as if contemplating where to look, then pulled out one of the drawers and began searching through the folders. Finally, she pulled one of them out, closed the drawer, and returned to the table where I was sitting. "Here it is," said Ismael Torres gently, placing the folder on the table. "This document has been kept here for over 30 years. "What does it say?" I asked, almost out of breath. "It's Felipe Treviso's will." I felt dizzy. I remembered how my grandmother called me Felipe when she regained consciousness for the last time. 30 years ago, Felipe left his house to his grandmother in his will. However, she didn't want to live in it. Now that she's gone, it belongs to you. I felt everything spin before my eyes. So my grandmother's words weren't the musings of a sick old woman. I still couldn't believe it. And then a simple thought occurred to me. Wait, but if my grandmother died, shouldn't the house go to my mother? But Ismael Torres shook his head. The point is that Felipe wrote in his will that, in the event of the death of Veronica, his grandmother, the house should pass to her male heir. He thought his grandmother had given birth to a son. So now the rightful owner of the house is you. My breath caught again. It wasn't easy to adjust to the idea that a house had suddenly fallen into my lap. Seeing my confusion, Ismael Torres opened the will folder again and took out a yellowed envelope. "Before we go any further with the paperwork, please read this letter. It was written to you by your grandmother." I took the envelope with trembling hands. The lawyer got up from the table and, excusing himself, said he was going out for a moment to have a coffee. I understood that he was only leaving to leave me alone with myself, and I mentally thanked the old man. When Torres left, I opened the envelope and pulled out several folded yellow pages. I unfolded them and began to read. "Dear Pablito, it's me, Veronica, your grandmother. I'm sorry I never told you this story while I was alive, but now the time has come and I hope you're ready to hear it. When I was 22, I got a job as a housekeeper in one of the richest mansions on the coast. The house was on the side of a mountain, and almost every window overlooked the sea. I couldn't have been happier. You know how much I love the sea. What's more, there was a huge old garden at the house where large walnut trees, fuchsias, and orchids grew. I was enchanted by both the garden and the house, and my cozy room on the first floor was impregnated with the most wonderful scents from the garden. My pupil was little Marisol, a wonderful 8-year-old girl. We studied French and Italian, did experiments, collected petals and leaves to dry between the pages of books. We ran to swim at the wild beach, collected shells and built stone forts. We sewed dresses and put on plays. Marisol loved playing the piano, and we made music together for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Our life was full of small discoveries and great happiness. Marisol's family treated me with great respect and kindness, and I began to feel as if I had always belonged there. Sometimes, before going to sleep, I imagined myself as Marisol's older sister. It calmed me down so much that I slept more peacefully. The only thing that occasionally bothered me were the strange sensations I sometimes felt in the garden. It seemed to me that someone was watching me. I looked around but saw no one. Only once did I notice a slight movement at the window on the 3rd floor. However, I knew that floor was uninhabited. Marisol's parents and the girl herself lived on the 2nd floor, so I decided it was just the wind. However, I soon discovered that I was wrong. It was a typical midday. Marisol and I were running around the garden playing hide and seek. The little girl suggested we play hide and seek. She said she would hide and I had to find her. I agreed, and, closing my eyes, counted to 100. Then I went in search of the girl. I knew that she liked to hide in a big hollow in one of the trees, so I didn't hurry too much so that the game wouldn't end too quickly. I walked along the path around the house, pretending to look for Marisol, when I suddenly noticed something strange. A white envelope was trailing down a thin wire. I looked up, but saw no one. The envelope was right next to me, and I took it in my hands. The thread fell nearby. I began to examine the envelope and was surprised to see my name on it. "Miss Veronica," read the neat letters. I raised my head again, trying to understand where this mysterious message was coming from, but once again I didn't notice anything unusual. All the windows were closed. I reread the inscription, and remembering that Marisol was waiting for me to find it, I folded the envelope and put it in the pocket of my dress. We played in the garden for a while longer, and then we were called in for lunch. After lunch, Marisol usually rested in the nursery, which left me with some free time. I retired to my room, threw myself on the bed, and took out the envelope, burning with impatience. I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of pristine white paper with a beautiful gold pattern on the edge. I unfolded it. The sheet was written in the same beautiful handwriting as my name. I began to read. Here's what the letter said. Dear Veronica, it's been 3 months since you showed up at this house, and every day it's become a little brighter because of you. You seem to have lit up the sun in the sky. That's how I feel your presence in my life. You're the most beautiful flower I've ever seen in our garden. You are enchanting and unique. Forgive my recklessness, but I couldn't contain my impulse any longer and decided to write to you. You have no idea that I exist, nor do you need to know who I am. I just want you to realize what a miracle you create for me every day. I wish you to remain as happy and serene as you are and bring joy to everyone around you. After I finished reading, I sat still for a while, trying to understand what had been revealed to me. There is someone else living in this house whom I had no idea about and who is watching me. Yes, they've been watching me since day one and I didn't have a clue. I felt strange and uncomfortable at the thought. Who is this mysterious stranger? I suddenly felt like the heroine of a 19th century novel. Could such things happen in real life? Desperately, I wanted to find out who the author of the mysterious letter was at any cost. This proved difficult. When I showed Marisol the letter, she just shrugged and shook her head. I've never seen that handwriting before. Mom and Dad write differently. Of course, I didn't dare ask the owners about it. Something intuitively held me back. I was terribly afraid of losing my job and my newfound magical life with Marisol. After a while, I asked one of the maids, the modest Miss Mia, if anyone else lived in the house apart from the owner's family and the servants. She looked at me alarmed and immediately looked away. She seemed to know something, but she wouldn't say. I could tell. So I decided to watch the maids and find out everything. The next day, just before lunch, I went into the kitchen and announced that I wouldn't be having lunch because my stomach was bad. I went to my room and slammed the door hard so that everyone could hear me inside. Then I slipped quietly into the hallway, closing the door behind me, and walked to the stairs. I deliberately took off my shoes to avoid making a sound and quickly climbed to the 3rd floor, finding myself on a small landing, on one side of which was a heavy, massive door and on the other a window. I approached the door and tried the handle. It was locked. Then I went to the window and hid behind the heavy curtain, giving me the opportunity to peek cautiously out from behind it. I didn't have to wait long. About 15 minutes later, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. It could only be Marta, a middle-aged woman who worked in the kitchen. I peeked carefully from my hiding place. As expected, Marta was holding a silver tray with lunch plates, a glass of juice, and cutlery. Marta put the tray on the table near the door and took a golden key out of her apron. Suddenly, my nose began to itch unbearably. Apparently, some dust had got into it. I hid behind the curtain and, unable to resist, sneezed, trying to do it silently. I heard Marta start to turn the key in the door, but then she stopped. Apparently, she had heard some noise. I held my breath. I didn't want Marta to discover me. However, the woman seemed to think she had imagined the sound. I heard the door creak. I peeked cautiously out from behind the curtain again, but the door had already closed, hiding Marta and the tray from me. Deciding not to try my luck, I slipped quietly behind the curtain and ran down the stairs. Finding myself in my room, I caught my breath, feeling safe. Although I had learned little, I felt like a winner. I now knew that the 3rd floor was inhabited, and that was where the mysterious stranger who had written me the letter lived. My imagination was already painting romantic pictures, inventing 100 scenarios of what he might be like and why he was locked away like a true recluse. In the end, I decided to write a reply. Here's what I wrote. Dear stranger, thank you for all your compliments. I'm very flattered. I'd like to know more about you. What is your name and why do you never leave your room? When everyone had gone to bed, I went back up to the third floor. I sealed the letter in an envelope and slipped it into the gap between the locked door and the floor. Satisfied with my achievement, I returned to my room. Just then, an unsettling thought occurred to me. What if someone among the servants found my message? I hadn't left a signature. Would they guess that I had written the letter, or would they immediately give it to the lady who had seen my handwriting many times in Marisol's notebooks? Why didn't I write the letter in block letters? In the end, I couldn't sleep all night, and the next day I was pale and tired. However, my worries were in vain. When Marisol and I were walking in the garden, and the girl was running between the trees in search of squirrels, a letter fell into my hands again. I immediately looked up and caught a glimpse of a hand quickly closing the window. As before, I hid the letter in the pocket of my dress, and Marisol and I played in the garden until lunch. When I returned to my room, I immediately took out the envelope and, tearing it open impatiently, began to read anxiously. Dear Veronica, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Felipe and I live on the third floor, as you may have guessed. I don't leave my room because I can't walk after an illness I had as a teenager. As I read these words, tears filled my eyes. I decided to become a recluse because I couldn't accept the change that had happened to me. I still remember the feeling of the grass under my bare feet, the soft pebbles of the beach, and the warm, gentle waves of the sea. Unfortunately, I lost all that, and now I live my life reading books and studying science. Besides, I love calligraphy and watercolors. Felipe's letter continued to describe his lonely life for a while longer. I felt sorry for him. I took a sheet of paper and wrote just one sentence. Can I see him? Then I did the same as the first time. I went up to the third floor and slid the note under the door. The next day in the garden, I received a reply. There was just one line in the note. Yes, today after lunch. I got very excited and was terribly distracted. After eating quickly and wishing Marisol a good rest, I went to my room. Felipe had chosen this time wisely. After lunch, everyone in the house had a short break, and the risk of someone noticing me going up to the third floor was minimal. I stood in front of the mirror and examined myself critically. After some thought, I changed into my favorite blue dress, the one I wore for walks, and pinned my hair up at the nape of my neck, letting a few wavy strands frame my face. Satisfied, I opened the door and quietly left the room. My heart was pounding in my chest. I even began to fear that someone might hear it. After a few deep breaths, I calmed down a little and started to climb the stairs. At the door to the third floor, I hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly. After a few moments, I heard the key turn in the lock. Apparently, my stranger was already waiting for me. My heart was about to leap out of my chest with fear. Finally, the door opened and I saw Felipe for the first time. He was sitting in a wheelchair and was quite handsome, with dark curly hair and kind brown eyes, broad shoulders and long, slender fingers, indicating an artistic soul. He looked about 25. He looked at me for a while, then bowed his head in a slightly respectful bow. I was completely embarrassed. Felipe stepped aside, making way for me, and I entered his domain. The entire third floor belonged to him alone. There were several rooms where he dedicated himself to art, painting, piano, woodcrafts, clay modeling. There was also a small kitchen and a library with many books. This place seemed like a secret world known to very few. Felipe's parents and a few loyal servants. Even Marisol didn't know she had a brother. It was surprising and very sad. Felipe served me tea and sweets, and we talked for a long time about literature and art. He was an incomparable conversationalist. He knew a lot and could talk about anything. 2 hours passed without realizing it. I was so intrigued by Felipe. When I accidentally looked at the clock, I couldn't believe my eyes. Gasping, I stood up and told him it was time to go back to Marisol. He nodded, looking at me with a long, sad look, and asked if I would come back. I said yes. As I hurried down the stairs, I realized that I was already looking forward to my next meeting with Felipe. We started meeting secretly every day, and I got to know this mysterious recluse more and more. He turned out to be wonderful, kind, noble, attentive, and sensitive. Felipe had an excellent sense of humor and was easy and pleasant to be with. Not much time had passed, but I couldn't imagine my life without him. At some point, I realized that I loved Felipe and felt that he loved me with all his heart. But could our relationship have a future? I feared that Philip's parents would find out about our meetings, and I would be fired immediately. This thought caused me wild pain. Now I understood that I would lose more than just a job. The opportunity to live in my dream house by the sea and spend time in Marisol's pleasant company. Above all, I was afraid of losing Felipe, my love. He immediately realized my state and approached me. My beloved took my hand and looked into my eyes. "What's bothering you, darling?" he asked. Tears filled my eyes. "I'm so afraid of losing you, Felipe," I confessed. "Where does this fear come from?" he asked, running his hand through my hair. I felt the touch of his soft fingers all over my body, which gave me peace and confidence. "Only if your parents find out, I'll be fired immediately. I'm sure they won't like that we're meeting secretly. I'm just a housekeeper and I should know my place." Felipe touched my lips lightly as if asking me to be silent for a moment. "Veronica, even if our parents find out, it won't change anything. I'm an adult now and I can decide what to do. And I love you, darling, and I choose to be with you. No one can keep us apart." I smiled at him, although tears clouded my eyes. I wanted to believe Felipe's words with all my heart, but a bad feeling was creeping up on me, poisoning everything. It seemed that we didn't have much time left, and that's exactly how it happened. Once, when I went to see Felipe, he said that he wanted me to become his wife. I was very happy to hear this, but doubt tore my soul apart. "We can't get married in secret," I told Felipe. "We need to tell your parents everything." He nodded briefly. "I'll do it tomorrow morning. They'll know everything." When I heard these words, fear shook me inside, but seeing the determination on Felipe's face, I said nothing. I stayed with him until late at night. That day, Marisol wasn't at home. She had gone out with her parents. We talked a lot, held hands, and Felipe kissed me for the first time. It was so beautiful that I couldn't help crying again. He stroked my hair, whispered sweet words, and said that everything would be all right. I didn't want to leave him that night. Something told me that we might never see each other again, but I tried to push those thoughts away. Felipe seemed very happy, and I didn't want to cloud his mood with my worries. When it was very dark, I wanted to say goodbye to Felipe, but he didn't let go of my hand for a long time. "Do you want to stay with me tonight?" he asked quietly. I looked at him hesitantly, but there was such a strong love in his eyes that my doubts immediately left me. I turned to him and, leaning in, kissed his lips. I stayed with Felipe until dawn, and we didn't close our eyes for a moment. His gentle touches remained in my memory forever. When the sun rose, I gave him one last kiss and told him it was time to go back to my room. He walked me to the door. On the threshold, I turned and looked at my beloved once again. He also looked into my eyes, and I felt that invisible threads connected us forever. When I got back to my room, I couldn't sleep. I was very nervous. I knew that there would soon be a conversation between Felipe and his parents, and I was looking forward to it. However, after a while, I fell asleep. I was woken up by a loud knock on the door. "Pack your things and get out of our house," I heard the lady of the house shout. "You're fired." At first, I thought it was just a terrible dream, but it was all happening in reality. I got up groggily and started packing up my modest dresses and books. It didn't take me more than half an hour to pack my suitcase. There was another knock on the door. "Are you ready?" I heard the lady's impatient voice. "We won't wait forever. Mister, Treviso is already in the car. He'll take you into town." I picked up my suitcase and opened the door. The lady looked at me with disdain. "Bold, promiscuous girl," I thought to myself. "You thought you could live off us," she said coldly, confirming my thoughts. "It won't work, street girl. And you pretended to be so well-mannered." "I hope you won't tell Marisol," I begged. The woman gave me a furious look. Don't you dare mention her name with your filthy mouth, she shouted almost in a fit of rage. I hope she learns to love her new housekeeper. Please don't tell her anything, I begged in a low voice. The woman said no more. I walked silently to the exit of the house and sat in the back seat of Mr. Treviso's car. He didn't say a word to me either, just drove me into town and dropped me off at the station. I stood in the middle of the square, pale, confused, and lonely. I managed to find a decent room in the city center, which I rented for a few days. I was sure that Felipe would come to town and look for me, so every day I went out and walked around the center near the station. I thought this would make it easier for him to find me, but I always returned home alone. I never found Felipe. I was desperate, not knowing what to do or how to proceed. The days blended together like raindrops. I missed Felipe, Marisol, and the house that seemed so beautiful to me. Then I found out that I was pregnant, and that I was going to have a son, Felipe's son. I cried for a long time, not knowing what to do. My savings were running out fast. I didn't know how to break the news to Felipe that he would soon be a father. Finally, I decided to write him a letter. For some reason, I was sure we were going to have a boy. I told Felipe everything on paper, and at the end, I wrote my address with a request for him to come as soon as possible. I didn't know how to prevent his relatives or servants from intercepting the letter. I couldn't trust anyone. Then I remembered Marisol. Only she could help me. I set off immediately, giving the driver almost the last money I had. He took me home, where I had spent so many wonderful days. Of course, I didn't ring the doorbell, trying to remain unnoticed. I walked along the tall, ivy-covered fence that surrounded the garden. Suddenly, I heard Marisol singing, and peering through the foliage, I saw the girl. She was sitting on the grass, not far from where I was standing. Marisol, I called, not too loudly. I didn't want anyone other than the child to hear me. Surely Marisol now had a new governess and she could be nearby. The girl turned around in surprise. Marisol, I repeated a little more quietly. Who's calling me? Asked the girl, startled. It's me, Veronica. I'm behind the fence, I replied, afraid that the girl wouldn't want to talk to me or worse, would call an adult. Marisol jumped to her feet and ran to the fence. Veronica, where are you? I miss you so much. Why did you leave me? She said quickly and slightly offended. I held out my hand to her. I'm here, Marisol. Forgive me, but there was nothing I could do. Your parents didn't think I was suitable for the role of your housekeeper. Marisol started to cry. But why? Let me talk to them. My new housekeeper is horrible. It's so boring with her. You'll have to learn to love her, dear. There's nothing we can do here. I'm sorry. I tried to comfort the girl. Marisol squeezed my hand and cried. It felt like someone was coming down the road. Listen, darling, I said quickly. Can you help me? The girl let go of my hand and wiped her tears with her fists. Of course, she nodded. Just tell me how. I slid a white envelope between the bars of the fence. Please take this envelope up to the 3rd floor and put it in the crack under the heavy locked door, I said. The girl took the envelope and turned it over in her hands. But why? She asked in surprise. It's a secret for now, I whispered back. I'll tell you next time. Just let it be our secret, okay? Make sure no one knows about the envelope. The girl nodded, smiling mischievously. I'll do as you say. But when will we see each other again? My heart squeezed. I knew that this was probably our last meeting, but I decided that a lie would be better than the truth for now. Soon, I said. I promise. I just nodded, barely holding back the tears. Marisol, where are you, darling? I heard a deep, unfamiliar voice. The girl was startled, quickly hiding the envelope in her chest. It's Miss Perez. She's looking for me, she said quickly. I have to go. Goodbye, Veronica. I stood by the fence for a long time, crying silently. Goodbye, my little girl. Goodbye, I whispered before leaving. I returned to the city, and the next day I developed a fever. With no money, I was on the verge of despair. Deciding to ask my neighbor for fever medicine, I somehow got to her door, and when she opened it, I felt like I was about to faint. The neighbor was a kind, elderly lady with a big heart. Seeing my condition, she took me inside, sat me on the sofa in her living room, and called the doctor. The doctor was a young man called Pablo. Yes, Pablito. That was his grandfather. It seems he fell in love with me at first sight. He prescribed me medicines, and when he found out that I didn't have the money to buy them, he went to the pharmacy himself. He visited me every day, brought me flowers, fruit, and sweets, monitored my health, and encouraged me with kind words. When I recovered, he often brought groceries and invited me to various places, concerts, theaters, or just for a walk. I thanked him sincerely for his help, but declined his invitations. However, he was persistent, so I told him what had happened to me. When he found out I was pregnant, he turned pale and, apologizing, left. I thought he wouldn't come back. I waited for Felipe, but he never showed up. I don't know why. Maybe Marisol hadn't been able to deliver the letter discreetly, or maybe his parents had forbidden him to leave the house. A week later, Pablo visited me again, carrying a large bouquet of roses in his hands. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. He said he was willing to accept my son as his own and promised to take care of me for the rest of my life. I cried, not knowing what to do. I loved Felipe with all my heart, but he never came, and both my son and I needed protection. I saw how good and noble Dr. E. Pablo was, and feeling immense gratitude towards him, I agreed to marry him. However, Felipe was always the only one in my heart. Dear Pablito, now you know the story of my first love, and I hope you won't judge me. I finished reading the letter and sat still for a while. Then I got up and went to the window, where swallows were flying. I didn't hear Ismael Torres return to the office. I see you've already read the letter, he said softly. I turned away from the window and nodded. Felipe Treviso died when his mother was 12. His parents died in a car accident 5 years before that. Marisol was already married and out of the house at the time. Felipe left the house to his grandmother in his will. We struggled to find her address and sent a letter. She came here, and that was our only meeting. Honestly, your grandmother is hard to forget. She had a special charm and fragility. Did she refuse the inheritance? She said she couldn't live in the house where everything reminded her of Philip. She didn't want to sell it either, so all this time the house has been waiting for you. I nodded and shook the lawyer's hand. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Now I know a bit more about my grandmother's life, and that means a lot to me. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss the details of the house? Today, I'd like to be alone for a while. Ismael Torres nodded and walked me to the door. I said goodbye to Sofia, left the building, and walked towards the sea. I spent a long time wandering along the shore, listening to the cries of the seagulls and the sound of the stones under my feet. Abuela, my dear, I murmured, you've kept the secret of your first love for so long, but I thank you for finally deciding to share it with me. I noticed a pink and white heart-shaped stone at my feet. I picked it up and threw it into the sea.